It started with a knock on my door that didn't feel neighborly at all. It felt like a warning. I had just come back from a calm walk through the neighborhood with Ranger, my service dog, when I opened the door to find two HOA board members standing there with clipboards pressed to their chests and identical tight smiles. Before I could even say a word, the woman in front, Brenda Holt, glanced down at Ranger and said, flat and sharp, "Pets are not allowed in common areas. You'll need to remove that dog immediately, or you'll start receiving fines." My stomach dropped. Ranger wasn't a pet. He was a fully trained service dog. He was the reason I could walk outside alone, the reason I could live independently after a medical diagnosis that changed my life. And here was my own homeowners association acting like he was nothing more than a rule violation. I tried to explain, calmly, carefully. Brenda didn't let me finish. She waved her hand and said, "We don't recognize emotional support animals here. The rules are very clear." That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't ignorance. This was control. What they didn't know was who my sister was, and they definitely didn't know what kind of fight they had just started. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Willow Ridge Estates sits just outside the small town of Fairview Creek, Tennessee, the kind of place real estate flyers love to call peaceful and family-friendly. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, streets so quiet you can hear sprinklers clicking on 3 houses away. When I first toured the neighborhood, people waved politely, but their smiles never quite reached their eyes. Still, it felt safe, controlled, predictable. And at that point in my life, predictability mattered more than charm. I bought that house because I needed stability. My health had already taken enough control away from me, and I wanted a place where I didn't have to fight just to exist. A place where I could focus on managing my condition instead of constantly explaining myself to strangers. A few years before moving to Willow Ridge, I had been diagnosed with a neurological condition that came with no warning signs most people could see. One moment I would be fine, and the next I would feel the ground tilt under my feet. Dizziness would rush in. My muscles would weaken. My thoughts would scatter. There were times I couldn't stand without help, times I couldn't even tell which direction I was facing. Independence became something fragile, something I could lose in seconds. Ranger changed that. After months of evaluations, training, and adjustments, Ranger was paired with me as a service dog trained specifically for my condition. He could sense subtle changes in my body before an episode hit. He would nudge me, guide me toward a safe place to sit, brace himself so I could steady my weight, and stay alert until the episode passed. In extreme situations, he was trained to help trigger emergency assistance. Ranger wasn't just support. He was freedom. He was the difference between being trapped inside my home and actually living my life. Because of that, I was meticulous when it came to paperwork. Before I ever signed the closing documents on my house, I disclosed Ranger as a service dog. I filled out every form the homeowners association required. I attached documentation. I followed every rule exactly as written. The HOA acknowledged receipt of everything. No objections, no follow-up questions, no warnings, nothing that suggested there would ever be an issue. For the first few months, things were exactly as advertised. Neighbors were curious but respectful. A few stopped to ask about Ranger. Kids would ask if they could pet him, and when I explained that he was working, they usually nodded and backed away. Some people even complimented how calm and well-trained he was. It felt like I had finally found a place where I didn't have to constantly defend my existence. Then the board changed. The previous HOA president moved away, and Brenda Holt stepped into the role. She was efficient, organized, and immediately very visible. New emails started coming through almost weekly. Reminders, clarifications, enforcement notices. The tone shifted from neighborly to authoritative almost overnight. At first, the violations were minor. Grass measured too high after a week of heavy rain. Trash cans left out 15 minutes past the approved time. A vehicle parked slightly over a painted line. Things that felt nitpicky, but not alarming. I assumed Brenda was just trying to prove she was doing her job. Then one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and felt my hands start to shake. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead. No greeting, no explanation. Just a bold subject line and a single paragraph underneath. Unauthorized animal use in common areas. Daily fine of $100 until resolved. I read it once, then again, then a third time. It didn't make sense. Ranger wasn't unauthorized. He wasn't an exception. He wasn't optional. Federal law didn't leave room for interpretation on that. This wasn't a preference issue. It was a right. I called the HOA office immediately. Brenda answered the phone herself. Her voice was calm, almost bored, as if she had been expecting the call. When I explained that Ranger was a service dog and had already been approved, she didn't hesitate. Willow Ridge is a pet-free community, she said. Any exceptions are at the board's discretion. I told her, carefully, that service animals were not pets. That they were protected. That I had documentation. She paused for half a second, then replied, "That's your opinion. Our attorney has advised us otherwise." That was the moment my stomach sank for real. Because I could hear it in her voice. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate decision. And that was when I knew this situation wasn't going to resolve quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation went from tense to openly hostile, almost overnight. Every time I stepped outside with Ranger, it felt like I was stepping onto a stage. Someone was always watching. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open and closed again. I started noticing Brenda Holt's silver SUV parked at the far end of the street far more often than coincidence would explain. It would sit there, engine off, windows tinted, like a silent reminder that I was being monitored. One afternoon, as I walked along the sidewalk, I noticed Carl Jennings, another HOA board member, trailing behind me with his phone held up, recording openly. He didn't try to hide it. When I turned around and asked what he was doing, he shrugged and said, "Just documenting violations." Violations. That word started showing up everywhere. The notices came faster than I could process them, slipped under my door, stuffed into my mailbox, sent by email and regular mail both, just to make sure I saw them. Each one was colder than the last, stripped of any pretense of courtesy. Failure to comply with community standards. Continued defiance of HOA rules. Legal action pending if non-compliance continues. There was no mention of discussion. No offer to review documentation. No acknowledgement of anything I had already provided. I tried to fight it the right way. I sent emails explaining, again, that Ranger was a service dog. I mailed certified letters with copies of federal guidance outlining service animal protections. I printed sections of the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, highlighted the relevant passages, and included them in my correspondence. I quoted the law directly, calmly, clearly, respectfully. It was like throwing papers into a void. Brenda finally replied to one of my emails with a single sentence. "Our attorney has advised us that service animals are subject to HOA regulations." I stared at that sentence for a long time, because I knew it wasn't just misleading. It was flat out wrong. Service animals are not optional. They are not privileges granted by boards or committees. They are protected by federal law, and HOAs do not get to rewrite that law because it inconveniences them. Brenda knew that, or at least she should have. And if her attorney truly told her that, then either she was being lied to or she was lying to me. Either way, it meant this was no longer about rules. It was about intimidation. The constant stress started to take its toll faster than I expected. My sleep suffered. My concentration slipped. I started feeling that familiar warning sensation more often, the subtle signs that an episode was coming on. Within 1 week, I had 2 episodes while outside. Both times, Ranger caught it before things got dangerous. He nudged me firmly, guided me to a bench or a low wall, braced his body so I could steady myself, and stayed close until the dizziness passed. Neighbors walked by pretending not to notice. One woman glanced over her shoulder like she was afraid to get involved. Without Ranger, I don't know how those moments would have ended. That was the cruel irony of it all. The HOA claimed Ranger was the problem, when in reality he was the only thing keeping me safe while they applied pressure from every angle. Then came the notice that crossed a line I didn't think they would dare to cross. I came home one evening to find a paper taped directly to my front door, bright white against the dark paint. No envelope, no privacy. Just a bold heading and a block of text underneath. It stated that the HOA intended to suspend my access to all common areas if I continued to bring an animal onto HOA property. Sidewalks, green spaces, shared paths, community entrances, everything. They weren't just trying to find me anymore. They were trying to confine me, to make it impossible for me to leave my house without violating their rules, to turn my own home into a cage. I stood there reading that notice, my hands shaking. Ranger pressed quietly against my leg like he knew something was wrong. Fear hit first, then anger, and beneath both of those something colder. Resolve. That night, after I peeled the notice off the door and locked it behind me, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my phone for a long time before making the call. When my sister answered, I didn't even know where to start. So I just said, "Lauren, I think my HOA is trying to ban my service dog." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything. And for the first time since this started, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. My sister, Lauren Whitaker, is an ADA attorney. She never leads with that. She doesn't advertise it at family gatherings or drop it into casual conversation. But for more than a decade, she has made a career out of representing people whose rights were ignored, minimized, or outright trampled by organizations that assumed they were above the law. She has gone up against corporations, landlords, school districts, and yes, homeowners associations that thought intimidation was the same thing as authority. When I called her that night, I expected questions. I expected interruptions. I expected frustration. Instead, she listened. I told her everything: the letters, the fines, the monitoring, the threat to block my access to common areas. I read sections of emails out loud. I described the way Carl had filmed me on the sidewalk. I explained how my health had already started slipping under the pressure. Lauren didn't interrupt once. When I finally stopped talking, there was a pause on the line. Not a long one, just enough to let everything settle. Then she said, very calmly, "I want you to stop responding to them completely." I frowned, confused. Silence felt like surrender. She continued, her tone steady and precise. "Do not email them. Do not call them. Do not explain yourself. Let them keep sending letters. Let them keep documenting their behavior." That was the first moment I realized this wasn't just about surviving the situation anymore. It was about building a record. Within 2 days, Lauren had drafted a formal response letter on her firm's letterhead. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't threatening. It was devastating in the quietest way possible. The letter cited federal statutes by name and section. It referenced binding case law that applied directly to homeowners associations. It outlined recent enforcement actions taken against HOAs for nearly identical behavior. It explained step by step exactly how Willow Ridge Estates was violating federal law by attempting to restrict my service dog. It also made one thing very clear. This wasn't a request. It was notice. Lauren sent the letter certified, with delivery confirmation. She CC'd the HOA's listed attorney, the management company, and the board as a whole. She even included instructions on how to remedy the violations immediately to limit their liability. Then we waited. Days passed with no response, no emails, no letters, no notices taped to my door. The sudden silence was unsettling in its own way. Part of me hoped it meant they had finally realized how badly they had misstepped. Lauren didn't share that optimism. "They're deciding how arrogant they want to be," she said. 1 week later, my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA portal. Not an apology. Not a retraction. A demand. The letter was formal, aggressive, and astonishingly reckless. It accused me of continued non-compliance and willful disregard for community standards. It threatened immediate legal action and fines totaling over $5,000 unless I permanently removed the animal from the property. Not just common areas. The property. I forwarded the letter to Lauren without adding a single word. She called me less than 5 minutes later, laughing. Not nervous laughter. Not disbelief. Genuine amusement. "Oh, this is perfect," she said. "I didn't understand how this could possibly be perfect." My chest was tight. My hands were shaking. All I could see was the number at the bottom of the page and the word permanently. Lauren explained calmly. They just escalated after being formally notified of the law, in writing. That moves this from ignorance to knowing violation. She told me that, in legal terms, intent mattered, and the HOA had just proven theirs. They hadn't just ignored the law. They had doubled down on breaking it. "They've handed us everything we need," she said. "Documentation. Timeline. Notice. Escalation. It's all there." For the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me. The fear didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. In its place was a strange, steady confidence. The HOA thought this was about enforcing rules. They had no idea they had just walked straight into a case my sister had built her career winning. Lauren didn't just respond to what the HOA was doing, she prepared for what they were about to do next. Within days, she filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, outlining the HOA's actions in precise, unemotional detail. She notified the state civil rights office as well, citing both federal and state-level protections. At the same time, she submitted formal records requests to the HOA and their management company, demanding copies of every communication, meeting minute internal email, and enforcement note that mentioned me or Ranger in any way. Then she told me to do something that felt impossible. Wait. No more reacting. No more defending. No more explaining. Just document and wait. A few weeks later, the first batch of records arrived. I still remember the look on Lauren's face when she opened the files. Her jaw tightened just slightly. It was the kind of expression she usually reserved for cases that were about to turn serious. The internal emails were worse than anything I had imagined. In one message, Brenda openly mocked my medical condition, calling it convenient and referring to Ranger as that fake service mutt. In another thread, a board member joked about how many fines it would take before I gave up. Carl Jennings, the same man who had filmed me on the sidewalk, suggested that forcing her to move might solve the problem faster. They weren't confused. They weren't misinformed. They were cruel. Lauren didn't raise her voice when she read those emails out loud. She didn't need to. Her tone shifted into something colder, sharper. Professional. "This changes things," she said. They didn't just violate the law. They documented intent. That was when she scheduled mediation. Not because we needed it, but because the HOA didn't realize they were legally required to attend. The mediation took place in a bland conference room at a neutral office building just outside Fairview Creek. Long table. Cheap chairs. Fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Brenda arrived first, flanked by the HOA's attorney and the property management representative. She looked confident. Almost smug. She greeted Lauren with a thin smile and glanced at me like I was an inconvenience she expected to outlast. When the session began, Brenda launched into her prepared statement. She talked about community standards, uniformity, fairness. She insisted the HOA was simply applying the rules equally to everyone. She claimed they had been patient, reasonable, accommodating. Lauren let her talk. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She didn't correct a single misstatement. When Brenda finally finished, Lauren nodded politely and reached into her folder. She slid a stack of printed emails across the table. "Let's talk about these," she said calmly. The room went quiet. Brenda picked up the first page, her expression neutral at first. Then her eyes moved down the screen. Her face changed color. The confidence drained out of her posture like air leaking from a tire. Lauren didn't rush her. She let Brenda read every word she had written. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every suggestion that I should be pressured into leaving my own home. Then Lauren spoke again. "These communications were sent after my formal notice letter," she said, "which means the board was fully aware of the law when these statements were made." The HOA's attorney cleared his throat. He asked for a brief recess. Lauren smiled slightly. "We're not even finished," she said. "This is just the internal correspondence." She then presented the timeline, the certified letter receipt, the escalation notices, the demand letter threatening thousands of dollars in fines, the attempt to restrict my access to common areas. Each piece laid out neatly, logically, impossible to explain away. Brenda tried to speak. The attorney stopped her. For the first time since this started, I wasn't the one being watched. She was. Lauren leaned back in her chair, hands folded, her voice steady and controlled. "At this point, you are exposed to federal penalties, personal liability for board members, mandatory corrective actions, and damages." Brenda stared at the table, and Lauren still wasn't finished yet. The mediation didn't just fail, it imploded. Less than 30 minutes in, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to openly panicked. The HOA's attorney leaned in close to Brenda over and over, whispering urgently, his hand partially covering his mouth like that would somehow contain the damage. Brenda's posture stiffened with each exchange. Her confidence curdled into defensiveness and then into something closer to fear. When Lauren calmly explained the scope of what the board was facing, the room went silent. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't threaten. She simply laid out the reality. Federal fines, mandatory corrective action, personal liability for individual board members, removal from the board, ongoing monitoring, damages. Each consequence landed like a weight on the table. The attorney asked for another break. Lauren declined. Brenda finally spoke, her voice tight. She insisted the board was acting in good faith. She claimed they were trying to protect the community. She repeated the phrase community standards like it was a shield. Lauren didn't argue. She just looked at her and said evenly, "Good faith requires knowledge of the law. You were informed. You escalated anyway." Still, Brenda refused to back down. She crossed her arms and said, "We're not changing our position." That was it. Lauren closed her folder and stood up. "Then this mediation is concluded," she said. "You'll be hearing from the federal government." And with that, we walked out. Within days, Lauren filed a formal federal complaint. Not a warning. Not a request. A full filing with supporting documentation, timelines, internal communications, and evidence of knowing violations. The response was faster than I ever expected. Investigators reached out within the week. They contacted the HOA's management company. They requested additional records. They began interviewing neighbors, not just about Ranger, but about the board's general enforcement practices. Then the official orders came down. The HOA was instructed to immediately halt all enforcement actions related to me and my service dog. All fines were frozen. Any attempt to restrict my access to sidewalks, green spaces, or shared areas was explicitly prohibited. Written confirmation was required. For the first time since this started, the letters stopped. Brenda didn't handle the loss of control well. A few days later, she sent a neighborhood-wide email blast. It was dramatic, vague, and carefully worded to sound alarming without saying much at all. She claimed that I was taking legal action against the community and that the HOA was being forced to divert resources as a result. The implication was clear. She wanted the neighbors angry at me. Phones started buzzing. A few people texted asking what was going on. Others avoided eye contact altogether when I passed them on the sidewalk. Brenda thought she could isolate me, pressure me, turn public opinion against me. Lauren shut that down within hours. She sent a factual, professional response to the same distribution list. No insults, no accusations, just the truth. She explained that there was no lawsuit filed by me against the community, that a federal investigation was underway due to the HOA's actions, that enforcement had been suspended because the board had violated federal law. She included references, dates, direct quotes from official correspondence, and she ended with a single sentence: "Misinformation will not change the outcome of this process." The effect was immediate. The narrative flipped almost overnight. Neighbors who had been distant started asking quiet questions. Some admitted they had received violation notices that never made sense. Others said they had been afraid to speak up before. A few apologized for not saying anything sooner. Brenda went quiet. Her emails stopped. Her SUV disappeared from the end of the street. Carl stopped filming. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I still remember the first morning I walked Ranger through the neighborhood without feeling watched. The air felt different, lighter, like a storm had passed and no one wanted to admit how bad it had been. The HOA had tried to control the story. They had tried to control me. Instead, they had invited scrutiny from the one place they couldn't intimidate or bully, and they were about to learn just how permanent that kind of attention could be. The final blow didn't come quietly. It came in full view of everyone. The HOA called an emergency meeting, framing it as a routine update. But by the time people started filing into the community clubhouse, it was clear this was anything but routine. Folding chairs filled the room. Neighbors lined the walls. Nearly half the neighborhood showed up, drawn by rumors, unanswered questions, and the sudden silence from the board. 2 federal investigators were already seated at the front when we arrived. That alone changed the air in the room. Brenda Holt sat stiffly at the head table, flanked by the remaining board members and the HOA's attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual sharp confidence replaced by something brittle. When she saw Lauren walk in with a thick binder under her arm, her jaw tightened. Ranger and I took seats near the aisle. He settled at my feet, calm and steady, as if this were just another routine appointment instead of the moment everything came to a head. The meeting was called to order, but it didn't stay under the board's control for long. One of the investigators stood and explained why they were there. Clear language, no theatrics, just facts. They outlined the scope of the investigation and confirmed that findings had already been made regarding the HOA's conduct. Then Warren stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She spoke the way someone does when they know the truth is already doing the work for them. She walked the room through the timeline from the beginning. The initial disclosure of Ranger as a service dog. The acknowledgement from the HOA. The sudden policy shift. The fines. The surveillance. The demand letter. Each point was supported by documentation displayed on a screen behind her. Emails appeared next. Names, dates, quotes. The room murmured when Brenda's words appeared in black and white, stripped of tone and excuse. The comment about the fake service mutt. The suggestion that pressure might solve the problem. Brenda tried to interrupt. She stood abruptly and said, "Those emails are being taken out of context. One of the investigators stopped her mid-sentence. "You'll have an opportunity to speak if necessary," he said. "Please sit down." She did. Lauren continued. She played audio recordings of board meetings where my name came up, where enforcement was discussed, where the board knowingly chose to proceed despite being warned. She laid out the legal framework in plain language, explaining what the law required and how the HOA had failed at every step. By the time she finished, the room was silent, no spin, no counter-argument, no room left to maneuver. The investigators conferred briefly, then delivered their conclusions. The HOA had violated federal law. Repeatedly, knowingly. Penalties were imposed immediately. The association was fined. Mandatory ADA compliance training was ordered for all current and future board members. Oversight requirements were put in place. Then came the part no one expected to hear out loud. Brenda was removed as president, effective immediately, and barred from serving on the board again. 2 other board members resigned on the spot, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. As for me, the investigators confirmed that damages would be awarded for the harm caused, including emotional distress and interference with my ability to safely access my own home. Through all of it, Ranger never moved. He sat quietly beside me, his presence grounding, steady, exactly as he had been through every episode, every threat, every moment of fear. When the meeting ended, people didn't rush for the exits. Neighbors approached slowly, some apologizing, some thanking me, some just nodding with a new kind of respect. Brenda left without looking back. That night, as Ranger and I walked home under the streetlights, I realized something. This wasn't just a victory. It was accountability, delivered in the only language the HOA had ever respected. Life at Willow Ridge didn't explode after that meeting. It softened. The change was subtle at first, almost easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Emails from the HOA slowed down. The tone shifted from commanding to careful. Words like must and will be fined quietly disappeared, replaced by phrases like please review and we appreciate your cooperation. The board stopped acting like an authority and started behaving like a group of people who understood they were being watched. Brenda's name vanished from everything. No signature, no announcements, no presence at the end of the street. The 2 board members who resigned were replaced by volunteers who spoke cautiously and listened more than they talked. Meetings became shorter. Decisions were documented. Rules were explained instead of enforced by threat. And then there were the neighbors. One by one, people approached me in ways they never had before. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly, like they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. A woman stopped me on the sidewalk and apologized for looking away when Carl filmed me. An older man admitted he had received violation notices that never made sense but was too afraid of fines to push back. Another neighbor thanked me outright and said, "You did what the rest of us didn't know how to do." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, relieved, and, for the first time in months, safe. Ranger and I walk freely now. No tense shoulders, no scanning windows, no bracing myself for another letter taped to my door. We take the same paths we always did, but they feel different. Lighter. Kids wave again. Some ask questions, genuinely curious. Adults smile instead of stare. Ranger moves calmly at my side, doing his job without interruption or suspicion. There are no notes in my mailbox anymore. No fines, no threats disguised as policy. Behind the scenes, the HOA rules were rewritten, not quietly, not vaguely. Explicit language was added to protect residents with disabilities and service animals. Training was required. Procedures were clarified. Exceptions were no longer called exceptions. They were called rights. That mattered more than any fine or penalty. Because what happened at Willow Ridge didn't just fix my situation. It set a precedent. It made it harder for the next board or the next Brenda to pretend ignorance. It gave future residents something in writing that couldn't be brushed aside with a dismissive tone or a smug smile. Justice, I learned, doesn't always look dramatic in the moment. It doesn't come from shouting matches or public blow-ups. It doesn't require humiliation or revenge. Most of the time, it comes quietly, built piece by piece through documentation, patience, and knowing exactly where the line is drawn. The HOA thought they could pressure me into compliance. What they did instead was teach an entire neighborhood that authority without accountability collapses the moment it's challenged properly. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evening with Ranger at my feet, the quiet feels real. Earned, not enforced. And every step I take through Willow Ridge reminds me of something simple and powerful. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was right. Looking back now, what still sticks with me isn't the fines or the threats. It's the realization that the HOA never really saw me as a person at all. To them, I was a line item, a rule to enforce, a problem they could pressure into disappearing if they pushed hard enough. What they never understood is that rights don't vanish just because a board votes on something. They don't bend to intimidation. And real power doesn't come from titles, clipboards, or who sends the most emails. It comes from knowing where the line is and refusing to step back once it's crossed. Ranger didn't just protect my health through all of this. He reminded me of something deeper. Every time I stood my ground, there were neighbors watching quietly from behind curtains and door frames, wondering if pushing back was possible. Standing firm wasn't just about me being able to walk my dog in peace. It was about proving that bullying wrapped in policy still counts as bullying. If this experience taught me anything, it's that knowing your rights can change everything. Not overnight, not without stress, but permanently. And sometimes the biggest victories aren't loud or dramatic. They're the quiet moments afterward, walking freely, breathing easier, and realizing you don't have to explain your existence anymore. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?